When you look at any gravestone, you see two numbers, the year they were born and the year they died. But even though these two numbers are extremely important, neither means as much as the dash in the middle. You see, that dash stands for all the days in between when we have a chance to make a difference. For all of you who have had the fortunate opportunity to know or meet Q, you know that he has had a lot of dash. Last year, we went back to his old Kentucky home and spent several hours with him to hear just how it all began. And although there is far more than what is included here, I hope you will see that Q has made the best of his dash.
Hi, I'm Quentin Alonzo Wright, and I'm named after my grandfather, Quentin James Wright, and my uncle, A.D. Wright.
The Wright family ancestors lived long ago in Chester, England. How did they get to Kentucky, in America? In the 1700s, Valentine William King and his wife Elizabeth Edwards King sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and settled in Dumfries, Virginia on Quantico Creek. Washington, D.C. is in this area now, but back then it was just a wilderness. They had 12 children. Their son William King I, fought against the British at Valley Forge in the Revolutionary War, and for his service he was given 1,782 acres of land in Kentucky. From Daniel Boone and other pioneers, they heard stories about good land and opportunities, so they left Virginia and moved to Coxs Creek, Kentucky in 1782 and joined the small settlement there. William King helped form the first Constitution of Kentucky in 1792. He and his wife had 8 children. One of them was named Abner. He came to Kentucky when he was 9 years old. Abner King grew up and became a colonel in the militia and a member of the legislature. He also worked as a land surveyor, measuring the land to help create maps and show boundaries, land parcels, man-made structures, and land features. He was also a zealous Baptist. Abner I had a son named Abner King II. Abner II grew up and married Nancy Stone, a school teacher. Abner II was active in Coxs Creek Baptist Church, and the records show that he was a large contributor. Abner and Nancy owned and farmed about 1,200 acres of land in Nelson County. Abner also worked as a surveyor on the border between the United States and Canada and the land between Kentucky and Tennessee. He was a large slave owner and had 4 or 5 cabins of Negro servants on his farm in 1899 when he died. During the Civil War, soldiers invaded their home. In the attack, a soldier died in the house and several swords, cannonballs, and other war implements were accumulated there. Abner and Nancy King had 8 children, one of whom was Elmira Lockett King. In 1875, Elmira married Mr. Wright. That's Quentin James Wright. QJ and Elmira, Q's grandparents, and they played a big role in the Wrights family life at Coxs Creek.
Coxs Creek was the first settlement in Nelson County. It was established as Cox's Station in 1775. Colonel Isaac Cox and 17 others from Virginia built a fort for protection from the Indians and started their lives on this land. It was given to them for their services in the Revolutionary War. Coxs Creek is about 6 miles north of Bardstown, Kentucky, and on Highway 31E or US 150. And it's located at what we call the crossroads. At this crossroads, one of the roads leads to the south to Bardstown, Kentucky. One road leads to the east to Fairfield, Kentucky. One road leads west to Samuels, Kentucky. One road leads northwest to Lenoir, Kentucky, and one road leads north to Louisville, Kentucky. Hence, the reason we call it the crossroads. At this busy intersection, there was a store which was called the Coxs Creek General Store, or often referred to just as the Crossroads. For years, the old general store was operated by J.O. Manning and Son, and he had a full range of merchandise, harnesses, feeds, groceries, clothing, hardware, and seeds of all kind. And it was what would you'd find today in an up-to-date general store. Like many places that you find today where men hang out in bars and stuff, well, the men hung out in a country store here to discuss their farming problems, or just to talk about the troubles in the world, or the things that need to be fixed, and anything that they wanted to talk to or about, they did it at the store. In the early days, there was a small post office just to my right across the road here. And later that post office was moved into the general store. And my dad, who was a rural mail carrier, he carried mail out of both post offices, both when it was here to my right or when it was in the store. Some of my most vivid memories are of my grandfather coming up the highway from his house to where I lived in his Model T Ford, blowing his horn, and he had a cutout on his car which made a lot of noise when he wanted to, and he would pick me up and bring me up to the store and buy candy. For a penny, I could get a stick of candy or a little ball of candy, a hard candy, and that was a big, big treat to me. One of the things that really stood out in my mind was when I was very, very young, maybe 6 years, 7 years old, he bought me a hand axe, which I used to chop kindling from old lumber or dead wood to start fires with in the fireplaces at home. And I mean, today that would be a dangerous weapon for a kid to have, but in those days it was just necessary that we knew how to use those things. In my middle teens, I worked in this general store as a general clerk or driving a truck to deliver groceries or other supplies around to the farmers, and fill cars with gas, and that was for $1 a day. And that was working from about 6 or 7 in the morning until 8 at night. When I worked at the store, Harold Hall owned it at that time, and Harold was a brother-in-law to my brother Franklin. Harold was an enterprising young man, but he was a guy that really liked pretty cars, fast cars, and that's the way he drove all the time. And funny thing about it was that I was the only young guy in the community that he would trusted to drive his truck. Here on this empty lot, a circus came through the community one time and wanted to set up a one-night circus stand here right near where I'm standing. But before the show started that night, they found out that their piano player was sick. Inquiring around the community, the circus director was led to my mother's house, and he talked her into playing the piano for the circus that night. And so they brought her here and put her up in the back of a big truck with a piano, and she played that night for the circus, and the family all got in free. That was a treat for me. But ever after that, we teased our mother about being a circus woman. Also behind me, there used to be a place they called a dipping station. It was a long concrete trough, and it was filled with a strong disinfectant that would kill diseases, bugs and stuff on sheep. And they would run the sheep through this this sheep dipping vessel, and they'd come in one end and go out the other, and then the farmers would drive the sheep on back home, and they drove them up and down the highway, coming here and going away. Also, there was a holding pen right close behind me that was called the stockyards. It was a place where the farmers could bring a hog or two hogs or several hogs or cattle or sheep and hold them in this pen until someone came in a truck to haul them to Louisville, where they could be sold at the stockyards there. We're at Coxs Creek Baptist Church, which is located about a half a mile east of the crossroads. Coxs Creek Church was formed in 1785, and it was in the first 9 years of operation at the church. They had no building in which to meet, so they met in different people's homes. They finally constructed a log building, and that lasted for about 25 years. And then after that, they constructed another building. And the third building on this site was made of brick in 1871, and they built it at a cost of $8,550. It was 40 feet wide and 70 feet long, and in 1929 it was remodeled because they had no Sunday school rooms. And my father designed the rooms and supervised the building of the rooms so that they would have places for the people to meet. During the summertime, they would have like what they call protracted meetings, long meetings. In the mornings, they would have a meeting from 10 to 12, and then at night they would have another one from 7 to 8. And in the morning times, the children and the mothers would come, and at night, well, the mothers, the children, and the dads would come. But during the daytime, the dads were mostly working, so they did not attend. The best I can remember is that the sermons they preached was hellfire and brimstone. If they couldn't get you any other way, they scared the hell out of you. In the summer of 1928, I joined this church and was baptized in my grandfather's rock quarry, which was like a pond. In 1935, they had the 150th anniversary of the church, and they had guest speakers, and I had two uncles who were Baptist preachers. They spoke. Other former pastors spoke. Before the service was over, a buddy of mine, Jack Hibbs, and I slipped out and went outside where food was lined up on wooden tables the whole length of the church on the side next to the cemetery. Well, Jack and I took a survey of the food, and we got a shoebox full of chicken wings, another shoebox full of banana croquettes, and 3 pies, and took them down and stashed them into my Model A Ford and ate all afternoon on that food. I spent a lot of hours in the cemetery back here to the left of the church behind me. At that time, when I was a young teenager, the cemetery was overgrown with weeds, briars, full of groundhog holes and poison ivy. It was the worst job I ever had. But I survived, and I'm proud that today it looks so much better. There used to be a stone wall at the back of the cemetery along the road that leads toward the other Fairfield Road behind us. Along that stone wall, on Halloween, these pranksters would come along and tear the wall down and put it across the road so people couldn't pass. At that same time during history, well, young men would take farmers' buggies and put it on top of the barns. They did take gates off of the hinges and let all the animals run loose. But there was no punishment at that time. You know, they didn't punish them or anything. But I do remember a funny story about in Bardstown, some of the boys had gotten an outhouse and put it on wheels, and was carrying it, pushing it around, pulling it around Bardstown when the sheriff found out about it and started chasing them. And they ran, and Sam Sweeney, along with the rest of them, jumped over a fence. Well, Sam lost his glass eye, and they never did find it. Speaking of outhouses, the church had no water. I mean, no water inside, no inside toilets. So behind the church, they had what we call a privy or an outhouse, which we call a toilet today. And the men and women's toilets were adjoining each other, except they had privacy fences that went in from opposite sides to go in. Well, the men's outhouse got in such bad shape that they decided they were going to have to build a new one, which they built off to the right of the church, out in an empty lot, all empty space out there. Well, on the appointed morning, the trustees and the deacons got together and met out there in that field to find out where they were going to put this outhouse. And like Baptists do, they got to arguing and bickering about where they're going to put it and which way it's going to face. Well, my dad, he was quite a jokester anyway, he said, "Why don't you put it on wheels and everybody can pull it around and use it where they want to?" In 1942, this third church building was destroyed by a tornado, and it was just completely torn apart, but it was rebuilt with the fourth building, which you see behind me. There was very little salvageable from that church, but my brother Franklin did manage to get 3 stained glass windows, but they all had broken glass in them. So after over 40 years, I went to his house, and I was living in Kansas. I came over to his house visiting him, and I repaired all the glasses that were broken in those stained glass windows. And his 2 sons now, Danny and Gene, have those 3 stained glass windows. In this new building, they have an upstairs and a downstairs both. They have inside toilets, inside sinks. They have a kitchen, and they have like a general purpose room where they can have dinners and so forth. And they also have a baptistry in there. Before that, people had to be baptized either in ponds or creeks, rivers or somewhere. So this church behind me has served the people well. Every time the church doors are open, well, my mother and dad, along with my siblings and I, were here. My mother was a pianist or organist for 40 years at this church, and my daddy served in different capacities. He was a Sunday school superintendent. He was a deacon in the church, and we had a little church orchestra that played every Sunday morning, and my dad played the violin, and my brother Franklin played the trombone, and I played the clarinet. The preacher's wife played the saxophone, and Franklin's wife played the saxophone. So we played together there. This was during the time when I was in high school. The home of my grandparents, Quentin James and Elmira Kingwright, was located at Coxs Creek, Kentucky, in Nelson County. It was roughly 8 miles north of Bardstown, 30 miles south of Louisville, on the west side of the Bardstown Pike, which is also designated as the Jackson Highway and U.S. Route 31E. The original structure of the house was a fairly large log cabin that had been sheathed and weatherboarded. Later, one or more additions to the house were added. There was a trap door in the center of the hall, leading to a dirt floor food storage cellar, and there was a door over it that was counterbalanced by weights, which were several Civil War cannonballs, which had been picked up in the area and wired together. Near the door leading to the outside, the kitchen door, was a small building known as a spring house. This was a wooden enclosed shelter over a small spring fed, and stairs led down about 4 feet to the water level, which was very cool. As there was no refrigeration at that time, the butter, milk, and other foods that may spoil would be kept in the cool water on the ground or near the water. Also on the farm was an ice house. This was a building built over a hole about 10 feet deep and about the size of an average room. There were no sides to the building so that the air could circulate through easily. In the winter, the men would cut slabs of ice from the lakes and ponds and the creeks, haul it to the ice house and layer it in the pit and cover it with sawdust. In the summer, the ice would be retrieved from the ice house and taken to the house, which would be used to freeze ice cream and or keep other foods cool. There was no such thing as refrigeration in rural areas before the 1930s. One rarely saw an iced drink out in the country. Elmire and Quentin James Wright had 4 sons. 3 of the 4 Wright sons, who lived to maturity, were born in this residence. Denton James, Leslie Thomas, and Ray Milton, who was Ray Milton, my father, and he was the youngest. The elder son, Abner Kingwright, was born in the old brick King residence, the home of his mother. All 4 boys and their parents, whom they referred to as Pap and Ma'am, worked and grew to maturity on the 360-acre farm. Later, this farm was increased to at one time covered 1,000 acres. Abner and Leslie became Baptist ministers. Denton became an educator, teaching in various places. The last job which he held was president of Campbellsville Junior College in Campbellsville, Kentucky. Ray, my father, was a fruit farmer and rural mail carrier for 41 years, starting in 1903. In 1906, while visiting his brother Abner in Washington, D.C., he met and married Alice Briggs, a native of Sheffield, England, who grew up in Washington, D.C. He was 21 years old and she was about 18. Ray's brother, Abner, performed the wedding ceremony, and right after the wedding, Ray brought his bride by train to Coxs Creek, Kentucky, where they lived with Ray's parents. Quentin James Wright's home at that time was located on a site which behind me where a present-day brick house is standing. Alice, my mother, quickly adjusted to farm life from city life and became a wonderful cook and homemaker, helping her mother-in-law. Alice became a favorite of her father-in-law, and he bought her a beautiful horse and buggy. This was very unusual for a woman at that time to have her own very own transportation. The 4 Wright brothers produced 11 children. Abner King had James, Leslie, and Janet. Denton James had Elizabeth. Leslie Thomas had Helen and Mabel. And Ray Milton had Ray Herbert, Hazel, Elmire, QA, and Franklin. Ray Herbert, Hazel, and Elmire were born in their grandparents' home place. Quentin and Franklin called Ray Wright farmhouse their birthplace. The 4 Wright brothers with their wives and the 11 cousins spent many Thanksgivings, Christmases, and other holidays celebrating at Grandpa's and Grandma's home place, and later at 3 of the brothers' homes, enjoying bountiful food and reveling and playing together in the hayloft and granary. We attended Sunday school church service in a Surrey and later in an early Model T Ford. Some of the cousins were fortunate to be able to spend part of the summer vacationing with their grandparents, cousins, and other kinfolks. We roamed in the fields, swam and fished in the creek and ponds, hunted in the woods, went sledding in the winter, and also what we call ice skating on the creek during the winter. The Wright clan was blessed with an opportunity to get to know, love, share, and enjoy each other to a greater extent than today's busy family find possible. The Quentin James Wright's home place, which, as I said, stood in the area behind me, was totally destroyed by fire and was later replaced by the brick residence which you see standing there now. Living with Quentin James and Elmira was a half-sister named Elizabeth. We called her Aunt Lizzie, and she lived with Quentin and Elizabeth in the original home place here. She was also a full sister to Dr. Alonzo Denton Wright. Everybody loved Aunt Lizzie. I mean, she was a spinster, and she had time to play with the kids. She would make clothes for the dolls. She loved games, and she loved to tell stories. She was a favorite aunt of everyone. Behind me is the home of Dr. Alonzo Denton Wright, and he was a half-brother to my grandfather, Quentin James Wright. And to me, he was Uncle Lonnie, and he's the man that I got my middle name from, Alonzo. We used to love to come to visit here because his wife, Aunt Wayne, she was one of the only places that I can remember where you could go and get iced tea out in the country, because you didn't have ice available, but some way or another, Aunt Wayne always had her iced tea with it, and glass straws in which to drink through. Uncle Lonnie used to make his medical rounds in a horse and buggy when most people of his means were using automobiles. But finally, before 1930, he did manage to get a car, and he was one of the only men that I knew of that hung on to horse and buggy as long as he did. I remember on Sunday morning, they would have a certain place in the church at Coxs Creek Church, where they would sit. At the church, usually the women would sit on one side of the aisle and the men would sit on the other, but Aunt Wayne and Uncle Lonnie would sit together, and I would sit with them and lie my head in Aunt Wayne's lap and go to sleep while the preaching was going on. My dad and I would come to this house because my uncle had a pond off to my left here, and it had a lot of he called them new light fish. I don't know what they were, really good fish. And one day, a particular day that my dad and I caught over 50 fish in one afternoon. One day, I was sitting on a bench in the back of the house with my Uncle Lonnie, and my dad and another man was taking honey from the bees. And I was a little fella, and my uncle told me, he says, "Don't get afraid of the bees." Says, "If they come and light on you, they light on your head, well, just take your hand and slap them like that, and then you won't have any trouble." So the next thing I knew, a bee came along and lit up here on his forehead. He slapped it. Well, he missed, and the bee stung him. He said, "Well, it works most of the time." I'm standing here surrounded by all this beauty at a place called Federal Hill, or better known as my old Kentucky home state park. It was here in this area in 1855 that Stephen Foster, while visiting his friend Judge Rowan, who owned the property, was inspired to write the song "My Old Kentucky Home," which most everyone is familiar with. This is my old Kentucky home, but this is my old Kentucky home. By 1916, Ray and Alice had 3 children, Ray Herbert, Hazel, and Elmira. And they began to feel kind of cramped living with my grandparents, Quentin James Wright and his wife Elmira, Lockett King. So they decided that they were going to build their own house. So by that time, my dad he had enough assets that he felt that he could afford to buy a small place, and so they chose a tract of land about a mile or a little bit over a mile south of my grandfather's place, and right on the same road, on a Bardstown Louisville road, and they had a house built on this property. And before the house was built, they built a barn and a chicken house, which you see behind me, and which is still standing. The house was built and sheathed with oak lumber that was cut from the property here and from the grandparents' property, and sawn and aged, and so then that was covered with a overlapping siding, and the roof on the house was tin. And after the house was built, they moved into this house in the fall of 1917, just in time for a big snowstorm that came along. The following July, 1918, I was born at the house here. When the house was built, of course, they had no electricity, and your illumination came from kerosene lamps, and your heat was from either wood-burning fireplaces or wood and coal were burned in the fireplaces, and you had the other stoves that were heated with wood, burned wood in it. And when I was born, my brother Ray was 11 years older than I, and my sister Hazel was 9 years older, and my younger sister Elmira was 4 years older. And it would be 2 years and 8 months after I was born that my brother Franklin was born, and I seem to have been the frailest of all 5 of them, because I was always having one kind of a sickness or another, and they didn't have the wonder drugs today that would cure you. And I even remember my dad blowing cigar smoke in my ear to relieve the hurting in my ears. I don't know if it worked or not, but that's what they did. And castor oil was a big deal then. It was a laxative, but really worked you over good, but it tasted terrible. And another medicine they had was calima. I don't know what it did, but they had it, and that was used for about everything. And the diseases at that time were dreaded ones: smallpox and scarlet fever and polio, and they didn't have vaccines or medicines for them at that time. I was always had mumps and measles and chicken pox and every other thing, plus lots of accidents that happened to me afterwards. Since we didn't have any electricity, a way to make for cooling, no air conditioning or anything, it was pretty rough during the summertime and real hot, and you didn't have electric fans and that kind of thing. The only thing you would have had would be a handheld fan that you used at the funeral parlor gave you. And in the wintertime, you didn't have the heat, so going to bed in an unheated room in the winter was kind of a chilling experience. The feather beds that we slept on helped a lot, though, because they were pretty toasty when you crawled into bed in a feather bed. In the summertime, if it got too hot inside to sleep, well, we'd go out in the front yard and just throw some cloth of some sort down on the ground and sleep outside, and the dog would be out there lying along with you, so we didn't have the traffic along the road to keep you awake like you would now if you tried to sleep right out by the road. The house consisted of a cellar, which you would call a basement today, and the cellar was used for storing potatoes in bins along the side of the walls of the cellar, and shelves of canned goods. And my dad even had a chicken brooder, a piece of equipment that you could put eggs in and hatch chickens. It was about the size of a piano, I mean, roughly. Also, we had a suspended tray with a wire bottom in it that hung from the ceiling and about 4 feet off of the ground. And it was usually filled with apples to be used during the winter time. In the summer also, we would get down there and freeze our ice cream down in the cellar. On the first floor, there was a kitchen and there was a pantry. And this pantry was used to store all kinds of food, and I had a dough board in there where they could roll the biscuits out. And in fact, when I was about 11, I started baking cookies and making them in that same little pantry. Later on, years later on, well, that pantry was converted into a bathroom. Next, there was a dining room, and that was a place where many big wheat meals were served in that, because my mother loved to entertain, and she was a wonderful cook. And we had lots of good family and friends meals in that place. There was a living room with a fireplace, and there was a parlor with a fireplace. The parlor was used for special occasions. You didn't go in there every day. You had for visitors and for girls to have their dates. And there was a stairway leading from that parlor room up to the upper story. And then between the living room and the dining room and the parlor, there was a hall, central hall, and there was another stairway in that hallway that led up to the upper story. In the 3 bedrooms upstairs, my mother and dad slept in one bedroom. My sisters, Hazel and Elmira, slept in another bedroom, and Ray Herbert slept in the 3rd bedroom. So that left me hanging out with nothing, no bedroom. So I slept in the bedroom with my mother and dad. And when Franklin came along, well, he also joined us in that same bedroom. So there's 4 of us in the bedroom. My brother Ray was 11 years older than I. So by the time he was 18, he went off to college, and I was about 7 at the time, I guess, and so that meant that I could move into his bedroom along with Franklin coming along with me. So that was the bedroom that Franklin and I occupied as long as I lived here. There are two stairways from the 1st to the 2nd floor, one leading up from the parlor and the other up from the hall. The stairways were very steep and slippery. When my brother Franklin was a newborn baby, my maternal grandmother was visiting from Washington, D.C., and while she was carrying Franklin down the front stairs, she slipped, lost her balance, and fell to the bottom of the steps. My baby brother was not hurt, but my grandmother died as a result of this fall. And I remember my mother leaving home and taking her to Washington for burial. The back screened-in porch, or paneled-in porch, was used for a variety of reasons or situations. In the summertime, we may have fresh vegetables stored in there, or crocks of milk, or just about anything. In the wintertime, we had our cold weather jackets hanging in there, boots. It was kind of a mud room before you went into the kitchen, and we had a wooden box about this wide and about this wide, and it was deep and about that deep, and we'd bring in firewood from the woodshed over here to my right, and we'd store it in there to be used. We'd fill that periodically as we needed, because we'd used it out of that box into the kitchen range rather than going out to the woodshed every time we wanted wood. And every night, you'd bring in the wintertime, you'd bring in maybe 3 to 6 buckets of coal to be used in the fireplaces. And what we didn't have sitting by the fireplaces would be stored in this porch here. And it was like a convertible porch. In the summertime, it had screened-in windows, and in the wintertime, it put wooden panels in so to keep it warmer, but it had one glass window that stayed in it all year round. On the second floor, there were 3 bedrooms and a little room that was made for eventually to have a bathroom, a toilet in. Of course, at that time there was no running water, so it was just used as a little extra room there, on the second floor. From the second floor, there was a stairway that went to a floored attic, and that was filled up with all sorts of things. You never knew what was going to be in that attic. And then the place that I really liked there was a place in the ceiling there that you could open up and get up on top of the house and sit up there and look all over the country. Since there was no indoor running water, because it wasn't available from the city at that time, there was an outhouse, a privy. You'd call it today a toilet probably. But we had an outhouse which was situated behind me about 70 yards. And it was a 2-holer. And we had no toilet paper at that time. No such thing as a roll of toilet paper. So it was always a Sears and Roebuck or a Montgomery Ward catalog hanging in there in the toilet. And if you're really unlucky, you got stuck when there was nothing but the slick, thick pages left. And that is the way that I remember this house as it was built. For water to use in the house, a cistern, a large round underground receptacle about 20 feet deep for collecting rainwater, was dug near the barn from which the rainwater was collected from the barn roof. A round cover of concrete covered the cistern, and a hand crank pump was installed on the concrete cover, and a pipe about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter went from the pump down into the water. A continuous chain with the rubber washers spaced about every foot or so ran down into the water and through the pipe and into the water, and then back up through a pipe to the pump. As you turned the pump crank, you brought up the water. All the water for drinking, dishwashing, clothes washing, bathing, cooling, and cooking, and hand washing had to be pumped and carried in 2.5-gallon water buckets 60 or 70 feet from the pump to the house. This was a big job on wash days especially. Water would be carried to the house, put in a 10-gallon copper container called a boiler, placed on the cook stove to heat it for washing the clothes, and then after heating it would be carried outside and put into 2 wash tubs. My mother would hand scrub the clothes on a washboard in one tub and then rinse them in the second tub. Then the clothes would be hang wrung and hung out on a wire clothesline to dry. It was a great day when my mother got a clothes washer and a wringer attached. In the winter time, my mother would wash inside, but the clothes would hang outside on the line and freeze dry, and it'd be stiff as a board when you had to bring, especially the sheets when you had to bring them in. In times of short rainfall, there was a big problem. In 1936, the weather was really, really dry, and water ran low, and we had to haul water from the creek to water the livestock and the chickens, and then for water for the house use, we'd have water hauled from Bardstown, Kentucky, and put in the cistern for use. And I would haul water from also from the creek so that my mother could have water for her flowers, and she loved her dahlias and cannas and roses and other annual flowers that she liked to grow. City water didn't become available until after I left home in 1939. The barn was built about 80 to 100 feet behind the house. It was whitewashed with a mixture of water and lime. This was a much cheaper way of creating a white look than using paint. The barn had 3 stalls for horses and 2 stalls for cows. And the cow stalls each had stanchions. That was a retaining device that would fit loosely around a cow's neck to confine it from moving about. My dad liked to feed the cat while milking. While we had 2 cows we had 2 cow stalls where we kept the cows. At times we had 3 cows to milk, and in such cases, Franklin and I would alternate milking 1 or 2 cows. One particular time, it was his turn to milk 2. I had finished mine and was watching Franklin sitting on a one-legged stool with a milk bucket between his knees and his head stuffed up against the cow's flank, milking away. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I tickled the cow behind her right leg, like tickling under one's arm. Well, the cow kicked Franklin up against the stall wall, and the bucket of milk went flying out from under the cow and splashed all over his face. Franklin got up, hit the cow on the rump with a slab of rock and said, "That'll teach you not to kick me." Then he whacked the cat and said, "That'll teach you not to scratch that cow while I'm milking." Franklin went to his grave never knowing the truth. The barn also had a corn crib where ears of dried corn were stored for horse feed, and a feed storage room for storing chicken feed. There was also a workshop. In here were kept all kinds of nails, nuts, bolts, woodworking tools, shoeing equipment, workbenches, and an anvil. On rainy days when I wasn't working out in the fields, I would spend a lot of time cracking walnuts on the anvil and eating them. Up above were two lofts with a drive-through separating them. In one loft, hay was stored. In the other loft, straw and wheat were stored. My cousins, James and Leslie, would come from Louisville, and we would have corncob fights from one loft to the other. The cousins really loved playing in the hayloft. On the farm was a 4-car garage originally built to store a Surrey, the forerunners of today's SUVs, a buggy, and my dad's mail wagon. These were all pulled by horses. The Surrey could haul 6 people or more on 2 or 3 seats, and it had a covered top. The buggy had only 1 seat for 2 people. The mail wagon was totally enclosed and had a container on the back to store mail. The route took about 10 to 12 hours, so the driver had to also carry a feed bag for the horses' oats. There were 4 chicken houses. In the 1920s, we had about 500 brown leghorn chickens. But for better egg production and more chicken meat to eat, the leghorns were replaced with the fewer Rhode Island red chickens. From these chickens, we might get 100 eggs a day. For spending money, my mother sold both eggs and butter to C.R. Barnes, who ran a produce store in Bardstown. Behind the garage, there were several hives called stands of bees. The hives were stacked in wooden form about 18 by 24 inches. Inside were racks where the bees stored the honey in honeycombs, and then sealed, capped. They capped in the honey so it wouldn't run out with the same type of wax from which the comb was made. Taking the honey was quite an undertaking. We would do this twice in the summer. My dad and 1 or more helpers would don gloves which came up to their elbows, and straw hats with protective mesh netting attached. The netting had a screened wire inserted in the front of the face, and the netting was tucked into the pants. There was a smoker that was used to repel the bees. The smoker was a metal can about the size of a quart jar with a hinged top and a bellows attached to the can. The top had a built-in spout through which smoke would be expelled as the billows were squeezed. The smoker filled with burning decayed wood and small amount of tobacco. As you smoked the bees, they would be repelled and fly away. As the racks of honey were taken from the hives, they would be brought into the back porch where the women folks uncapped the honey. As the comb is 2-sided, both sides had to be uncapped. The uncapped honey, 4 racks at a time, were placed into a hand-cranked extractor. By centrifugal force, the honey was ejected from the comb. The racks were then turned and the other side were ejected. As there were several dozen of these racks, a whole day was spent taking honey. As honey accumulated in the bottom of the extractor, it would be drained into 5-gallon containers. 20 gallons would be a good day. About 30 or 40 feet east to the left, that's to the left of the garage, was my dad's coal frame. It was about 4 feet by 6 feet with a glass cover over it that could be raised and lowered. Each spring, he'd sow lots of tomato, cabbage, carrot, green pepper, onion, cauliflower, and broccoli seeds. When it came time to garden, we had lots and lots of plants to put out, all that we wanted and even some to give away. Another building was the woodshed engine room. This was a divided building and was situated near the back of the house. One part was used to store wood, which was used for cooking and heating the house. In our house, there were 4 fireplaces and the kitchen range. Wood was cut from dead trees and limbs on the farm, hauled to the back of the woodshed, cut into 18-inch lengths, and stored in the woodshed. Every few days, wood was carried into the back porch and put in the wooden box to be used as needed. Coal was used in the fireplaces, and this was stored outside in a coal bin, which was not covered, it was open, and the coal would be carried into the house in 4 to 6 buckets each night during the winter. The other end of the building was used as a workroom and later known as the engine room. In the summertime, the wood burning range was replaced by a kerosene burning stove in the kitchen because it created a lot less heat. Within a few years after moving into the new house, many improvements were made. In 1925, my dad purchased a Delco electric system. This consisted of 16 2-volt batteries connected in series, which produced 32 volts of direct current electricity. The batteries were kept charged by a generator built into a Delco gasoline engine. The gasoline engine started automatically when batteries became low in charge. This system was housed in the building, which we call the engine room, adjacent to and a part of the woodshed near the back of the house. Batteries were stored on 2 shelves near the generator. A neighbor, D. Taylor, helped my dad put the electrical wiring into our house. All appliances and light bulbs were 32-volt direct current as opposed to the 110-volt alternating current which was used in the cities and then and is used everywhere in the U.S. today. My dad was always open to new and better ways of doing things. He was a problem solver and could do or fix anything about that he put his mind to. In the early 20s, we had an ice box stored in the downstairs hall of the house. Each Saturday during the summer, an iceman would deliver 100 pounds of ice, which he put into the ice compartment of the ice box. The ice was produced in Bardstown in 300-pound blocks. An ice pick was used to separate the ice into 3 100-pound pieces. 100-pound pieces were chipped into smaller pieces for people when they wanted less. When we planned to make ice cream on Sunday, we would get an extra 25 pounds of ice to use for that. And this ice would be placed in a burlap bag and pounded with a heavy mallet called a maul. Ice cream was frozen in a hand-cranked 1 gallon or 1.5 gallon can placed in a wooden bucket surrounded by crushed ice and coarse salt. The ice box with the ice in it had water as the ice melted. The water would be collected in the bottom of the ice box and then drained out through a hose, through a pipe, through a hole in the floor under the ice box, and then drained on into the basement where it went out through a drain down in the basement. In the late 20s, my parents purchased a Serval refrigerator that operated on kerosene. This was a welcome appliance to replace the ice box. It eliminated the mess that was always created when the iceman brought the ice and the inconvenience of the chipping and all that to get ice to be used in the kitchen for our drinks and things. After the Rural Electrification Administration, known as the REA, was created to serve electricity to rural America, 110-volt alternating current electricity became available in 1939. Jack Raymond, a friend in Campbellsville, Kentucky, came from Campbellsville and removed all the 32-volt wiring, bulbs, appliances, and so forth, and rewired our house with the 110-volt AC electricity. This meant that all appliances and bulbs, etc., had to be replaced. By this time, I was working in Washington, D.C., and my dad sent me an article from the Kentucky Standard, a newspaper published in Bardstown, showing that my dad was one of the three largest consumers of REA electricity in the county. My parents had already been using electricity, so when REA became available, they took full advantage of it by replacing the limited electricity that we had in the Delco system and added lighting to all the buildings on the farm. They used electric motors wherever possible. For most rural people, this electricity was a novelty. Since there were no public telephones in the country, my dad and interested neighbors got together and constructed a telephone line to serve the participating members. This required putting up telephone poles, stringing wire, and equipment for a switchboard, which we referred to as an exchange, wherein and out calls could be connected. People living in rural areas at that time learned to become innovative in order to get things done to make life easier. They didn't have to wait for someone to do things for them. The switchboard was located in the Hibbs house at the junction of US 31 and the road leading west to Solitude, Kentucky. The exchange was manned by Mrs. Hibbs. She plugged in the wires for each call, and she would connect each person to the person calling them. Their system was known as a party line. Each member had a particular ring, like three short rings and one long, or three long rings, or a combination of any one or two or three rings that you wanted to have. Everyone knew the other's rings and would listen if interested. This was the only means of rapid communicating and was a great gossip and alert system. 6 very long rings, for instance, meant a fire somewhere. The telephone itself hung on a wall. It was about 20 inches tall, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. It had an extended mouthpiece and an earpiece about 6 inches long on a 3-foot cord. A hand crank made the phone ring. We had this system for about 23 years until an up-to-date telephone system became available after 1940. U.S. Highway 31E passed in front of our house. In 1918, this was mostly a gravel road. By 1923, a new paved 2-lane highway was being constructed, and we enjoyed watching the activity and talking to the workmen. The only powered equipment used was a steam shovel for moving earth and rock, and a steam roller used to roll road bed and asphalt. These machines were powered by steam. Other work was done by men using hand tools and equipment pulled by mules or horses. This equipment consisted of wagons, graders, and mule-drawn scoop shovels. When the road was completed, we were delighted to see more traffic. We would sit in the front yard on Sunday afternoon and watch the cars pass by. Many sightseers drove out from Louisville 32 miles to check out the new road. My brother Franklin and I would choose sides. He would take Fords and I would take Chevrolets, and we'd see who had the most cars. Most of the cars on the road at that time were Model T Fords and Chevrolets. Some other cars being sold at the time were Dodge, Buick, Star, Whippet, Stutz, Auburn, Flint, Maxwell, Overland, Cadillac, and Lincoln, and others that I can't remember right now. Before 1926, the cars didn't have roll-up windows. They didn't have electric windshield wipers. They had two-wheel brakes. They had glass that was not safety-proof. It would just shatter when it was hit with anything, and which is very dangerous. The cars were all, there was no such thing as automatic shift, and they were entirely different from what they are today. Early in the 1920s, my dad had land cleared and planted a large peach and apple orchard. There were also two smaller orchards, one near the highway and another between the barn and the hen house. There were also a few plum trees, cherry trees, and pear trees scattered around the house. By 1926, the orchards were producing well, and my dad would haul fruit baskets from Louisville in and on his recently acquired Model T Ford. As the orchard trees grew, so did production, and in the early 1930s, we had as many as 30 men working the orchard in the summertime. They were paid $1 a day. Franklin and I hauled the fruit from the orchard in a wagon pulled by two horses. In 1936, my dad had a roadside market built, and it was ready for use during 1937. We sold peaches, apples, grapes, honey, cider, vegetables, all homegrown. As our house was on US 31E, the main highway from Chicago to Miami, it wasn't uncommon to have gangsters from Chicago stop by to buy fruit. I can remember that Pretty Boy Floyd and Al Capone had stopped at one time. In the spring, people would come from miles away to see the vast display of pink peach blooms and the white apple blossoms. After World War II started in 1942, it became harder and harder to find men to do the work. After 1945, the orchard was no more. Dad had the trees bulldozed and burned. The land was returned to pasture. I was the fourth child born into my family. In 1919, when I was a little older than a year, my parents took us, 4 siblings, to Washington, D.C. in a Model T Ford. We visited my mother's 2 sisters and their families. This was a trip of over 600 miles each way in an open car that used water-resistant cloth curtains for protection, had carbide lights, and very little power. There were only 2-wheel brakes, no windshield wipers, no heater, no power steering, no radio, no seat belts. It was just a basic car, basic transportation. The roads were terrible, with many made of planks or saplings, which are small trees laid crosswise to form a corduroy road. There were no road maps and very few road signs. Motels were non-existent, so it was hard to find lodging. Along the way, we would stop and ask homeowners to take us in for the night or to recommend someone who would. Since the engine had no fuel pump, it was necessary to back up the mountain road so that the fuel could flow to the carburetor. My parents, I have to admit, were very true adventurers to attempt a trip like this. 2 years and 8 months after I was born, my brother Franklin was born. Franklin and I played together as brothers. We enjoyed our wagons and our scooters, and when we got too unruly, my dad would settle us down with his belt. But we especially enjoyed sledding in the winter. Mr. and Mrs. John Wolfe owned the farm across the highway about a tenth of a mile north of our house. And their house sat on a hill. At the back of their house was a long, fairly steep hill, just right for sledding. And in the winter, this was our favorite place to go and where we were always welcome. After a morning of sledding, we would go into Mrs. Wolfe's warm kitchen, snow-covered and all, and she would have glasses of milk and a big pan of cookies. She called them sweet cakes, right out of the oven. Our most exciting time was Christmas. We never saw any evidence of the holiday until Christmas morning. When Franklin and I would go to bed on Christmas Eve, our parents and older siblings would bring in and decorate the Christmas tree, put up the presents, and hang the stockings. The tree was a cedar tree cut on our property, and it was decorated with some store-bought items plus homemade things like popcorn strings and colored paper chains. The stockings were the same black cotton ones we wore most every day, and they came all the way up over our knees. There was always an orange and apple in the toe of the stocking, and the stocking was filled with assorted nuts and hard candies and small toys. This was the only time of the year that we saw an orange. Our favorite gifts were small wind-up metal trucks, cars, spinning toys, yo-yos, wagons, and scooters. When I was 6 years old, I started to elementary school here at this location, which was the Coxs Creek School. It's about a fourth of a mile west of the Coxs Creek General Store. And this building has since been converted into a house where people live. And all the buildings as you see around here were not here when we went to school. Only the school with 2 rooms. There's no screens on the windows. And we had big pot-bellied stoves like this that we heated with wood in those stoves. And the water that we drank came from a well that was right here where this pile of dirt is now. And we had no cafeteria here, of course. So we brought our lunch from home, and we brought them in. We didn't have fancy lunch boxes like they have today. I remember the one I had was one that tobacco had come in, and I carried this tin can with my lunch. But I'd say one thing, that the lunch was better than what they have today. My mother would get up and fry chicken for us for our lunch, and maybe make little individual chocolate pies, but we lived well off of her lunches. My mother would come to pick us up from school on rainy days, and she was one of the first women around that drove a car at that time. And we had a big old Buick car, and she'd bring and pull it around the back here, back up, get us and pull back out. My mother also was was the first lady in this community that cut her hair short. They used to wear their hair down almost about to their waist, or put up in a bun, or like a knot or something on top of their head. And she had hers cut off short, so she was a pioneer on hairdos, at least. The outhouse for the men was way back, maybe 100 or 200 feet back on a hill back here, and the girls' outhouse was down to the other side of the building back here, and then up on the hill behind the schoolhouse was the barn where they kept the horses or ponies that some of the kids living a farther distance from home than we did from here. They would ride their ponies or horses and keep them in the barn during the day while they were in school. And sometime for fun, well, the boys would get bushes, which we call buck bushes, and we'd go to the barn where the bumblebees had made honey and tear off part of the boards between the stall and walls and fight the bees and get their honey that they'd made in between the stall walls. The only playground equipment that we had would be like a ball made with rubber bands or string. And if we really got lucky, we would have a rubber ball that was bought from a store. and we'd play baseball. Right out on the ground over here was all open, and but for a bat, what we had was a slat out of a broken school desk, and that's what we batted the ball around with. The other thing we played, well, we played marbles. The boys would get down, we played all kind of marbles on the ground. It was all skinned off nice and smooth. And then the boys and girls would play a game called Ante Over, in which we'd choose up sides, teams. One would get on one side of the schoolhouse and one on the other, and then they'd throw a ball over the schoolhouse. And if you caught it, then you'd run around and try to hit somebody on the other side, and then they became part of your team. So you did that until one team got them all. And that was the extent of our playground equipment. About the time I started school, or maybe a little bit before, in my early childhood, I remembered having all kinds of sicknesses. I was the punis one of the whole five of the five children in my family, but I would have earaches, and I remember my dad blowing warm cigar smoke in my ear, and whether that helped or not, I don't know, but it must have helped some because he kept doing that. And I had the mumps and the measles and chicken pox and all those kind of diseases, and later in life I had many, many accidents. But at that time, we didn't have the wonder drugs that they have today. About the only thing we had was a pill called Calama, and another stuff that was castor oil, which tasted nasty, and that was a good laxative. It really worked. And the things that were really dreaded was polio and smallpox, scarlet fever, and we didn't have any vaccines for hardly anything at that time. The people that had tuberculosis they'd be sent to sanitariums, and they'd stay there until they either died or they were kind of cured and they were able to come home. Since I was born in 1918, at the end of World War I have vivid memories of some of the veterans who came home with all sorts of maladies. They had been poisoned by gas. They had some limbs maybe off. They had other disturbances in their minds that they couldn't get things straightened out. And but as a general rule, as they got older, they assimilated into the community, and we didn't hear much about them talking about their experiences. In 1926, when I was 8 years old, my mother took us to Louisville and bought me a long pants blue serge suit. This was unusual, as most boys didn't get a suit at this age. This was the first time I wore long pants. Normally I wore either short pants with long stockings or knickers with socks. Knickers are pants that reach below the knee and fasten with a buckle. They're normally worn with argyle, that's diamond patterned, socks that reach up to the bottom of the knickers, and golfers sometimes wore these knickers also. One day, not long after I got the new suit, my parents, Franklin and I, were going home from church, and my dad stopped the car on the side of the road in front of the house to let Franklin and me out of the car. My parents took off going to my grandparents' house. Without looking, I dashed across the highway, and I didn't see what was coming. I didn't even look. All of a sudden, a car hit me and launched me into the orchard, which was about 30, 40, 50 feet away. Franklin screamed, and my dad heard him. My dad came back, looked at me, and then went to tell my mother. He said, "Alice, don't get excited, but I think he's dead." They carried me into the house, put me in bed, and called the doctor. I had no broken bones, although impact had broken the headlights out of the car. I regained consciousness the next morning and wondered why I was sore and what had happened. My brother Ray would carry me up and down the stairs for several days until I recovered in about 2 weeks. The two men in the car that hit me were very concerned. They were truck drivers who were off for the weekend, and after that they would stop by periodically to check on my health. Something else different and fun we did during the summer was to attend the Chautauqua. Going to town for this was a big deal. I think ours was the only family from Coxs Creek that went to the Chautauqua. Chautauqua was a traveling theater that came to Bardstown every year for several years, and it came in July. The players performed outdoors in a tent twice a day for about 2 weeks. My mother would buy the series of tickets for our family to attend the show at 10 a.m. During intermission, ushers went up and down the aisles to selling candy. I can't remember much about the plays except one of them was called New Broom Sweeps Clean. Later in 1928, my dad purchased a 1928 Chevrolet with a deep maroon color with red disc wheels. In the early fall, our parents took Franklin and me to Norfolk, Virginia and Washington, D.C. to visit my brother's sisters, Ada and May. On this trip, I had my first waffle in Virginia, in Bristol, Virginia, on a Sunday morning. And my second movie that I saw was Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times on Granby Street in Norfolk, Virginia. I had seen my first movie, Ben-Hur, while I was in Bardstown while attending grammar school. After we returned from the trip, Herbert Hoover was elected president that November. I'm a half a block off of the Nelson County Courthouse Square, and I'm standing in front of the building where my orthodontist was. This is where I came to get my teeth straightened and where I came about every week to get my braces tightened up. Just before my last year in grammar school, my parents decided that I needed to have my teeth straightened. Braces were pretty much unknown to people in our area or anywhere else. No one ever saw a person with braces where we lived. The first doctor I went to put long gold-colored caps on my front 4 teeth to correct an underbite. Well, this didn't work. Then I went to see the new orthodontist in Bardstown. His name was Dr. Wheat, and he had recently graduated from the School of Dentistry at the University of Kentucky. He put braces with bands on my back molars and wires connecting to the front teeth. I went to have the nuts adjusted every week. After the front teeth were straight, he put braces on my eye teeth, my incisors. It was a long, painful process, but eventually it was successful, and it cost my parents $50. When I was in 8th grade at Coxs Creek, they had hired a new teacher, Lucille Ganote. As was the custom of the day, the school teacher would come around and to ask your parents' name and address. I mean, not their name. We didn't have an address because everybody was just plain Coxs Creek. Well, before she got to my desk, I reached up and turned my eyelids wrong side out and thought I would give a shock to the teacher when she came to my desk. Well, she got there and I looked up at her, and she didn't say a thing about my eyes. Thought that was natural, I guess. And she said, "Take those nasty things off of your teeth, out of your mouth." I said, "I can't." She said, "What do you mean you can't?" I said, "Well, they're braces, they're fastened, they're wired to my teeth. Look, see?" Well, she just couldn't believe that she had learned something that day. She thought she was going to teach it all to me. Well, after that, we got off to a memorable start, and Miss Ganote and I became real good friends, and I made good grades under her. When I was 13, I was scheduled to represent Coxs Creek School in a track meet, as I was the fastest runner in school. On the day of the meet, two men working on our farm were cutting down a large, dead sugar maple tree. It was about 3 feet or more in diameter. Since my scheduled race wasn't until about 11 o'clock that day, I decided to go into the woods and watch. Unfortunately, I was in the wrong place when the tree fell. It fell across my left leg, breaking both bones and pinning me under a limb. One man dashed to the house to tell my mother and to get a car, while the other dug me out from under the tree. By the time they got me to the house, Dr. McClure, our country doctor, was there. They'd put me in bed, and I held the head of the bed while my mother and the doctor pulled and set my leg. I had no pain medicine or anything. They just worked on me and straightened it out. A few days after the splint had been put on, it became apparent that there was a big problem. My left leg was infected and fluid was seeping out of the cast. When part of the cast was cut away, you could see that the flesh of my leg, about the size of a 6-inch circle, had been killed by the falling tree and was rotting. You could actually see the bones and tendons. While lying in the bed, it was less painful for me to keep my leg bent at the knee, so this turned out not to be a good idea. Many days I worried that I wouldn't be able to walk again. After much treatment and with the medicines of the day, treatment with the medicines of the day, and 6 weeks of healing, I was able to get out of bed and try the crutches. On my first attempt, I fell to the floor. By keeping my leg bent so long, I couldn't straighten it. Then I really got concerned. After a few days, I asked Franklin to bring me a brick. I tied it to my shoe and walked with the weight of the brick pulling down on my leg. I started walking the mile to school on crutches while using the brick to stretch my tendons. It was a great feeling when I could touch the tip of my toe to the ground. Gradually, I got back to normal, but I had a very large scar on my leg that needed protection. I wore elastic sleeve on the leg for many months. I didn't know at the time, but the impact of that injury wasn't over and would influence my life in the future. When I finished 8th grade at Coxs Creek School, I had to take a county test before I could go to high school in Bardstown. I was the only boy in my class that passed the test, but I resented having to take the test since the students who went to elementary school in Bardstown did not. As a rural mail carrier, my dad left early in the morning for his route delivering the mail up and down the rural roads. Before the roads were improved in the 30s, he delivered by horse-drawn mail wagon and would not get finished his route until late in the day, and always after dark in the wintertime. Later, he made his deliveries by automobile, and he would get home around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. By this time, I finished elementary school at 8:13. I began to assume more responsibilities around the farm. Before he left each morning, my dad would leave me a list of things that were to be done that day. I became the head man, overseeing as many as 30 men until my dad got home. All through elementary school, Franklin and I had chores to be done each day. There were 2 horses to feed and put down straw in their stalls, 3 cows to feed, milk, and bed down, chickens to feed and water to take to the house, wood to split, fill the firebox, bring in the coal, and there was always gardens to cultivate, plants to hoe, vegetables to pick, chicken houses to clean, eggs to gather, farm equipment to repair. I enjoyed working on the engines for the various machines, the corn sheller, the cider press, the water pump, power sprayer, and of course, the Model A Fords. After all that, we had our homework to do. My dad loved to play games. We played rook, pit, checkers, pachisi, carom, others, and popcorn was always a big item around our house. We would pop it, at first we would pop it over the fire in a wire basket. It was shaped about like a shoebox with a 3-foot handle. In 1933, I built a Model T Ford car out of junk parts. I scouted around here, and this person's junk pile and that person's junk pile, and I finally got most of the parts, but what I couldn't find, my daddy would find for me. I never drove it much, and then it was just around on the farm. I never on the highway, but it was fun, and I learned a lot. One day, soon after my dad returned home from his mail route, he was taking a nap. Just before lunch, my mother asked me to go to the store half-mile south for a loaf of bread. When I went to get my bike to go get the bread, the bike had a flat tire. I went in and told my dad, I said, Mom wants a loaf of bread and wanted me to get it, but my bike's got a flat. He said, well, why don't you go in my Model A? I said, it'll give me the keys. I had never driven, but had spent hours and hours sitting in his car going through the motions. Well, I went out, started the car, got into it, backed out the driveway, and drove off to the store. Drove all by myself to the store and back. What a thrill, man. I was on my way. Well, we had a 1926 Buick at the time, so I started driving it too at 14 years of age. At that time, there was no driver's license required and no speed limits and no insurance needed. Before school started in 1934, Dad got rid of the Buick and bought me a used 1929 Model A Ford. I drove whenever and wherever I wanted. We had our own gas pump in the driveway. I didn't realize at the time how fortunate I really was. In 1935, when I was about 17, my parents went to Washington, D.C. and Norfolk for 2 weeks. They drove their Pontiac. They left me in charge of my younger brother and the farm. My dad also had a 1929 Model A that was rarely driven over 45 miles an hour, while I drove my car only mostly one speed, wide open. While they were gone, I told Franklin I had something I wanted him to help me with, so we drove both of the Model A's into the 2 center parts of the 4-car garage, and I put in fence stretcher pulleys up in the top of 2 of the garages there, and then pulled in the Model A's in there, and I pulled out the engines out of the 2 cars, and then pushed the bodies back out and switched and dropped the engines into the opposite cars. And then I had me a car that ran a whole lot better than I had before. And so after graduating from high school in 1936, my parents and Franklin and I left on a vacation, and I was driving the Pontiac, and we got almost to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I told my dad about switching those engines into Model A's. And the only remark that he had was, I thought my car got awful sluggish all at once. Back around 1932, we had a pastor at Coxs Creek Baptist Church that had 2 daughters. One of them was a really cute girl, and they also had a younger brother. Well, the pastor left and went to Rossville, Georgia, and took his family with him, of course. And in 1933, they came back from Rossville to Coxs Creek for a vacation. And while they were here, the McClure girls who lived in this house decided to give a party for the two girls. Lunell was the younger of the two girls, and she was a little beauty, and I really liked her. And when they invited people to the party, I was not invited, but my sister Elmira was. That didn't suit me too well, so during that afternoon of the party, I called the Hibbs boys who live across the fields here about a half a mile or so, and asked them if they'd like to go hunting that night. And their name is Jack Hibbs and Chris Hibbs, and they said, yeah, they'd like to go. Well, about dark that night, I piled my German police dog and my brother and the girl's brother into the old Buick we had, and drove over to the Hibbs boys' house. They got their Airedale, and the five of us started walking across the fields hunting. Well, they didn't know what we was hunting, but eventually the dogs treed a skunk in a fence corner, and I hollered to them. I said, "Don't let that dog kill that skunk." So I was carrying a burlap bag and a forked stick, so I ran up into the fence corner, got sprayed real good by that skunk, and put that forked stick over that skunk's neck, put him in that burlap bag, and my hunting days were over. But they didn't know it, so we kept on across the fields, and by strange coincidence, we came up to a fence directly across the highway from a McClure house where the party was going on. I told my brother and the Hibbs boys, I said, I'm going to the party. Well, all of them but Jack says, well, they're not going. So Jack said, I'll go with you. And Jack he was a buddy, he was the same age as I was. So Jack and I climbed the fence, and we came to the front door of this house and knocked on the door. When they opened that door, Jack and I just rushed in the front door, came around into this room right here, and started up these steps with that skunk in that bag. Well, Jack and I went on up the steps, went down the hall upstairs, and came down these steps and out the front door, or out the back door, went right around back here, went out the back door, and went on back home to the Hibbs boys' house. After we got back to the Hibbs boys, we left them off and went on back to where I lived and where Franklin and I lived, and I buried my stinking clothes and went inside and awakened my dad and told him what I'd done. Well, he said, I can't much blame you. And so I went on to bed thinking everything was fine. So next morning I got up, went to the barn to milk, and by the time I got up, Elmira had already gotten up and told Daddy the whole story about me and the skunk. Well, Dad gave me a real good talking to in front of Elmira. But as soon as he and I got away from her, we both had a big, big laugh. This is Coxs Creek, the creek from which our community got its name. The first span across the creek was a wooden covered bridge built in the early 1800s. That bridge was replaced by an iron bridge, which was being used when I was born in 1918. I have vague memories of that bridge. When a new road was built in the early 1920s, the iron bridge was replaced by a concrete one and is the one still in use today. The iron bridge was dismantled and rebuilt over Coxs Creek on the road to Lenoir. The creek runs along the north side of our farm and holds many fond memories for me. It was here in a pool just below the bridge that I learned to swim and where I fished. Even in the driest of years, there was always water in this pool. My dad once told me that a well had been dug here and that the pool was fed by a spring. It was from this pool that I hauled water during the drought in 1936 to water our livestock. During the winter, when our cousins would come from the city, We would go on a place north of above the bridge and skate on the frozen creek. Also during the fall and winter, I would set traps along the creek bank to catch muskrats, mink, and weasels. I would skin the animals, stretch the hides, dry them, and then sell the pelts for a little spending money. Sometime during the summer, my brother Franklin and I would bring a chicken and other food down to an island in the creek and have a camp and cookout. This is the creek from which, in 1934, 1935, I hauled rock and sand to make the concrete sidewalks, retainer wall, and the retainer wall at our house. Today, the creek hardly resembles the stream of my youth. 80 years ago, this was a running stream with little vegetation in its stream bed. Now it is nearly clogged with vegetation. When our house was built, no provisions were made to keep our many chickens from roaming free anywhere they wanted to go. We had chickens coming from the hen house down to my right down here. We had chickens in the chicken house behind me back here, then they were free to roam around the yard. And we had no sidewalks. We had to walk on planks to keep out of the mud or the dirt. And there was no much grass on the lawn and a lot of weeds. And consequently, it just looked pretty sad for a house that we had. And this condition existed for 12 years or so until I finished the 8th grade. Before I started high school, I approached my dad with a plan that would correct this condition. First, I would fence the yard to keep out the chickens. Next, I would lay concrete sidewalks from the house here and over to the woodshed and then into the engine room, and another one sidewalk going out to the outhouse. And I would also make the sidewalk going from the side of the house out, or the back of the house and the side of the house and the front of the house out to the driveway. And also put in retaining concrete walls along the edge of the lawn to keep it from, well, the dirt from washing down onto the driveway. Now, I told my dad that in my spare time I'd haul sand and rock from the creek and beat the rock into sizes we used for making the concrete. And then all my only request to him was that he would furnish the cement and the fencing and one of the men to help me do the work. Well, I would haul sand and rock from the creek, and man, I'd beat and haul and beat and rock for months and months. I'd beat the rock with a rock hammer into small pieces, and after the deal was struck, well, I really got to work, and many a load of material was hauled up. Untold hours of beating rock, but in the meantime, the fences went up, and we had no more chickens to deal with in the yard. After many months, Frank Adkins, he was one of the guys that helped us. He and I started building forms, mixing and pouring concrete, and eventually we completed the concrete work, and I was so proud. Next, I hauled loads of rich soil from our wooded area and distributed over the area around the house to even up the ground with the concrete. And after it was smooth and leveled, I sowed bluegrass seed. Soon we had a lawn of which the family was proud. Before I entered my junior year in high school, my project was finished and I had gained confidence in myself, and my parents were proud of me. I'm standing in front of the site where the old Bardstown High School stood. And I started the school here in 1932. At that time, the first year of my high school, I rode to school with Pauline Hetty, which was a sister to the girl that my brother Franklin married. She had a Chevrolet that she took about 6 of us to high school, and at that time, in 1932, they were rebuilding the road between Bardstown and Coxs Creek. So you could not use that road, so she had to drive from Coxs Creek to Samuels, and then from Samuels to Bardstown, and coming up from this direction over here. The second year of my high school, I rode the school bus, and that wasn't a whole lot of fun. In 1934, before I started my junior year, my dad had sold the old Buick that we had and bought me a used Model A Ford sedan. And for 2 years I drove it to Bardstown High School, and the parking lot was just about where this area right over here is now. And there was only 5 cars of all the people who went to high school. There was only 5 cars that parked in that parking lot every day. And I had one and 2 of my buddies had one, so we were free to go and come when we wanted to. There was no, well, they did have a cafeteria here, but we chose not to eat in the cafeteria. One reason we liked food from home, and the second reason was it was cheaper. There was no special activities in the school available other than sports and band. And I played football for 1 year, and I played band for 4 years. 1 year I kind of doubled up. And there were only 39 of us in our graduating class, and I don't know, but maybe 1 or 2 other than I that are still living. People that know me well can't imagine that I would ever misbehaved in school, and most of them are right. But my sister Elmira laid the groundwork ahead of me, telling me how bad the teachers were, and I was expecting the worst when I got here. And so about the second or third day of my junior year, I was going to take a class under Catherine Garrison, a red-headed teacher. Elmira told me what a terrible, terrible person she was. Well, on that second day, I jumped in my Model A and I was heading to town, and I saw Catherine Garrison walking along the street. So I stopped, asked her if she'd like a ride. Man, I took her home, and it's just like we were good buddies after that. I mean, I never had any problem at all. Another teacher I had was my algebra teacher, and Sabina Kelly. And my brother Ray was in class with her, and being such a character as he was telling me how terrible Sabina Kelly was. I mean, he really told me how bad she was. Well, I found out that she was a good teacher, and I made excellent grades in my math classes. I had another teacher that had gone to school with my grandfather. And she would compare me to my grandfather, and she taught English literature, and I just hated English literature. And some days she would call on me for some assignment, and I would goof up on it, and she'd say, "Kingwright, you jackass! What would your grandfather say about you anyway?" And so, you know, she really bore down on me. But back at her, I found out way back in there somewhere, she kind of liked me some way or another, because every year when the seniors graduated from high school, they had a play that they put on. And they were meeting one day over in the elementary school to pick out the cast for the play. Well, I knew it wasn't any use of me going, because I wasn't I wasn't going to have a part of it. So I'm wandering around in the hall somewhere, and she meets me. And she asked me how come I'm not back over in the building where they're having a selection of the cast for the play. And I said, well, I figured it wasn't any use of going. Get over there. So I go over. Well, lo and behold, when they start giving out the parts, I had the star part. And that one kind of floored me. In the fall of 1936, I entered the School of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Kentucky. By December, my left leg, which was previously injured by the falling tree, developed a sore and wouldn't heal. After coming home for Christmas holidays, I was unable to return to school for my second semester. In order for the leg to heal, I had to sit with it elevated or lie in bed. Needless to say, 1937 was most discouraging for me. By summertime, I had healed somewhat and spent a year doing work around the farm. In the fall of 1938, I entered Campbellsville Junior College, where my Uncle Denton, D.J. Wright, was president. The students there at the college didn't call him Denton or President Wright. They called him Devil Joe for DJ. I had a new Ford V8 to go to college and had so much fun with the students. Now, I may have been sort of spoiled by the students because my uncle was president, but the profs were harder on me so that they wouldn't be accused of showing partiality. One week, Franklin wanted my car for some reason, so he and a friend, Cloudy Bell, rode with me back to school, and then they took the car back to Coxs Creek. On the way home, he slid on wet pavement, turned over, and totaled the car. Neither one was hurt, but it wrecked my car. This was in the fall of '38, and I did without a car after that. I soon realized I wouldn't have a need for a car. This was a period during the Depression, and jobs were practically non-existent. My brother Ray had a master's degree in math and was working for $1 a day and couldn't find better work. During my high school days, Ray insisted that I take a government examination, which I did. This examination was for an apprentice to a printer. I made about 97% on the test. I was doing well in college and enjoying life. I had a great Christmas that year at home with family and friends, not dreaming of what lay ahead. I returned to school on January the 3rd, 1939. On January the 4th, my dad showed up at the college with mail for me. It was a telegram from the U.S. government telling me to report for duty in Washington, D.C. for a job where I would be making $980 a year. This was $3 a day, 3 times the going rate for laborers. At the time, you could get a decent meal for 35 cents, 3 large candy bars for a dime, a suit for less than $25, a pair of shoes for less than $4, and a room and board with 2 meals a day for $30 a month. I got my belongings, left college, went home and bid farewell to my family and the farm I'd loved. My dad took me to the railroad station in Louisville and gave me $100. I was on my way to D.C. and a whole new life experience. I reported to work on January the 5th, 1939 as a messenger in the office of the Secretary of Agriculture. The staff had looked up the population of Coxs Creek. When they saw it was 39, they were all set to receive a real hillbilly. Instead, they saw a well-dressed young man right out of college coming down the hall. They were really, really disappointed. The following August, I went home on vacation and had a picture taken for them. I told them this is how we dress at home. This made them happy. At my job, when I first started, I delivered mail and inter-office communications in the Department of Agriculture buildings. There were 27 miles of corridors in these two buildings. I took agricultural news bulletins and market news to the radio stations, and I had a streetcar pass that I could go anywhere I wanted to on business or pleasure because I could keep it for my own use. And it saved me a lot of money, gave me a chance to see a lot of Washington. Something interesting I did in that job was to assist in making a movie, and it was a company called March of Time, a movie production company that made films about different things. And this particular film was going to be about the Department of Agriculture. And these films that they made were shown as shorts before or after or the regular movies that they were showing in the theaters. The Secretary of Agriculture selected me to serve as a guide for the company. I helped make arrangements for showing off our department and got to see up close how personal how films were made. And now for the rest of the story. After my grandmother Wright died in 1928, my grandfather, Quentin J. Wright, sold the home place to his cousin, Ida Stoner, and her husband, Proctor J. Stoner. Grandpap and Aunt Lizzie, that was my grandfather's half-sister, lived a few months with the Wright family before moving to a small house which he purchased in Mount Washington, Kentucky. Grandpap died in 1914. Grandpap died December the 14th, 1934. Several years after being sold, the home place was completely destroyed by fire. It was replaced by a modern brick house on the same site. My parents, Ray and Alice Wright. Well, my father Ray died on February the 13th, 1962 at the age of 76. Soon after his death, the farm and buildings were sold to Norman Fury and his wife. They converted the large kitchen to a family room, and the back porch was converted to a modern kitchen. The Furies have maintained the entire farm and facilities in excellent condition. After selling the farm, my mother had a modern brick house built in Jeffersontown, Kentucky, 2 houses away from her daughter Elmira. She lived here until her death in October 16, 1968, at the age of 80. My brother Ray Herbert, married Elsie Southwood. He went to work at Langley Field, Virginia for NACA, which was the National Advisory Committee of Aeronautics, which later became NASA. And he went to work there in 1937 as a physicist. One of his earliest projects was to develop a material that could withstand 500-mile-per-hour speeds for windows in airplanes. He lived in Hampton, Virginia until his death. They had 2 sons and 3 daughters. He died December 6, 1982 at age 75. My sister Hazel married Frank Groom. She worked as a secretary at a lumber company. They had 2 daughters, lived all her married life in Louisville, Kentucky. She died July 7, 2005 at age 96. My sister Elmira married Tommy Brannon. She worked in a doctor's office. Her husband, Tommy Brannon, as I mentioned before. They had 1 son and 1 daughter. She lived all her married life as a homemaker in Jeffersontown, Kentucky. At this time, September the 20th, 2008, she's 94 years old and living in a nursing home. My brother Franklin married Imogene Heddy, also from Coxs Creek. They had 2 sons. They farmed tobacco, hay, hogs, cattle. He also owned Right Way Service, an appliance repair business in Bardstown. He lived all his life in Coxs Creek, Kentucky, within 2 miles of his birthplace. He died February 13th, 2005, a few days before his 84th birthday. Both he and his dad died on a February the 13th. That brings me down to me. I went to work January 5, 1939 in Washington, D.C. as a messenger in the Office of Secretary of Agriculture in the U.S. Department of U.S. Government. I moved to New Orleans, Louisiana on January 10, 1941. I worked as a clerk in the National Cotton Office of the Department of Agriculture. In 1943, he married Jenny McCaskill from New Orleans. They had one daughter and one son. On July 1, 1973, when the New Orleans office was combined with the office in Kansas City, I moved to Overland Park, Kansas. In July 1975, after 36 and a half years of government service, I retired as chief of the Cotton, Rice, and Dried Beans Division of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. As of September 2008, I'm still living in Overland Park, Kansas, at age 90. I think I've talked enough.